Hi, Grace. And then who else do we have? Hello, hi, Kristine. So I think we are all here. The speakers are all present. Hello. So before we start, let me give the floor very briefly to our colleagues, Emilia and Olivia, who will show how this works technically. Emilia, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. So a few quick technical tips before we start. It's very important that everyone listens and actually do what we ask, because it will save time during the webinar. And here are the technical requirements to run Click meeting. So if you're able to hear us, it doesn't mean that you actually meet those requirements. It's very important that you do meet these requirements if you plan to ask a question during the Q&A session. So please make sure you use the right browser mentioned, either for a PC or a Mac, whatever you're using, and that the latest version of Adobe Flash Player is installed and enabled on your computer. So what I'll do is I will paste those information in the chat window in case you don't have time now to go through it, but please, again, if you plan to ask any question, please make sure you meet these requirements. Alors, if you wish to ask a question during the Q&A session, if possible at all, please use headphones, because this really avoid any echo issue. And of course, once if you're using headphone or not, please make sure you enable your microphone. So there's a frame called Camera and Voice, and at the bottom of this frame, there's a little microphone icon. So you need to click on it and click on Use Mic and Speakers. Please make sure the volume is set at this level, not more than that, because otherwise it's too much. Not less than that either. Voila. And then when you want to ask a question, when we will switch to the Q&A mode, you will see this icon. You just need to click on it to ask your question, and then you will be prompted to answer this question. And of course, then you click yes, and then you will be able to ask your question, providing, of course, you have enabled your microphone, of course. Voilà, I think that's it. If there's any issue, feel free to send a message in the chat window, and we'll try to help through that channel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you, Olivia and Emilia. So we move now to the introduction. So first of all, welcome. We at the Small Arms Survey, we have tried to support the process of the development of the indicator, the methodology for the indicator on measuring conflict-related deaths already for a while. So the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, represented here by Grace, recently organized a meeting that was to start presenting their methodology. And in the very commendable attempt at trying to engage as many stakeholders as possible, we would like to use this opportunity to give them the floor to share this methodology, so that the participants, who are all highly qualified, I can see from the list of names in the participants list, they can provide feedback that comes from a civil society angle that is likely to support a more, let's say, UN approach that that has, for the time being, informed the process. So just very briefly to go through what we have done over the past few months, years. So we have published two briefing papers. Here you see the covers of these two briefing papers. One is tracking conflict-related deaths. It's our colleague Irene Pavesi, who is also listening to the webinar. She mapped a wide range of sources of conflict-related deaths, trying to identify what kind of background and what kind of information they provide. And the other one, the title was Beyond the Battlefield, that practically tries to look at what kind of methodologies and what kind of measurement processes can be used to go beyond the measurement of direct conflict deaths. So normally thinking of conflict-related deaths, one could think of stopping at the violence-related deaths, but in reality the impact of conflict is much broader. And the indicator 16.1.2 talks about conflict-related deaths in general. It doesn't stop at direct. So I see that there are some messages in the chat that maybe Emilia, if you can read them. Okay. Technical issues. So the methodological issues are being discussed in both papers. What should I do?
If you turn off the video, it should be better.
Okay. So this way you don't see me, but you should be able to see better the PowerPoint. Okay. Basically here in the tracking conflict-related deaths paper, Irene mapped 43 sources, and out of them only 3 were from international organizations. So this gives you the feeling of the wealth of information that comes from civil society, from academia, from other actors other than the international organizations. And here, very quickly, you see that also the definitions may be challenging in this current scenario of the mapping. You can see that the background, can be completely different, and the mapping, the methodology that is used for measuring may differ really widely. Okay, then more. As I said, in this other approach beyond the battlefield, we tried to go and think of the challenges of looking at the health and the structural consequences of conflict and what kind of impact can have on mortality, considering the aspects of excess mortality and other methodologies such as survey-based. Recently, we also, now I don't know how to advance because you asked me to, so I lost the thing. Okay. Recently, we have launched the executive summary in anticipation of the publication of the global report. That is the global report on violent deaths. That practically gives you a feeling of the scope. So what happens when you start counting, then how many people you count. And globally, what we have measured is approximately 560,000 violent deaths per year. 18% of them are conflict-related. Obviously, this is a first estimate that will benefit from the development of more precise methodology that is going in parallel for the aspect of the crime-related, of the homicide, and the conflict-related now with what we're discussing today. So with this introduction, we have today speakers who will, apart from Grace, who will introduce the methodology, and then the other 2 speakers will present 2 examples, 2 case studies. One will be connected to the concrete experience of collecting information on casualties, and it is Hana who will present the results of her study. Will also be published in a forthcoming briefing paper with us, and Kristine will present the very well-known leading program of OCDP on conflict deaths. So now, how do I do that? I will get out and I will give Grace the leadership. Okay, Grace, the floor is yours. Do I have to do something?
Maybe she can mute. Okay.
Can you hear me well?
Okay, now you're there. Okay.
If I can just off my camera so you can hear it better.
Yeah.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Grace Sanico Steffan from the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. I am the focal person for the development of the methodology and collection for the SDG Indicator 61.2, number of conflict-related deaths per 100,000 population by sex. My colleague.
Sorry, Grace.
Sorry,
Grace, we can't hear you very well. Can you turn up the gauge of your audio? There's a little arrow next to the microphone.
Okay.
Yes.
If you turn up the gauge, let's try it.
Okay. Yeah. Is it better?
Much better.
Thank you.
Better.
Sorry about that.
So I was just introducing myself, and I was also going to say I'm also joined this afternoon by my colleague Nicola Facel, who is leading the work on this indicator, and also Sonia Miller-Rappard, who is leading the work of OHCHR on casualty recording. And they'll be happy as well to answer questions later in the session. So we began the work for this indicator with a work plan that was supported by the prior working group and the IAG SDG, which highlighted that the approach to be taken in the development of the methodology should be based on international humanitarian law and human rights law, should not overlap with SDG Indicator 16.1.1 on intentional homicide, and should be based on existing practices. So we began the work with the support of a small, so we benefited from the review of the existing data sources on conflict deaths by the small arms survey that Anna just mentioned earlier. We also did review of UN sources such as UNAMI, and the casualty recording practices of OHCHR field presence. In addition, we contacted statistical offices of Palestine, Philippines, and Colombia to better understand their existing practices. And two of the key findings that came out from this review are the need for standardization and data partnerships. So with these parameters as oops, this one is not something wrong with this slide. I'm not sure. Are you guys also having this? So this is just a blank slide, but
It's white.
yeah, sorry. So this is supposed to be a summary, but okay. So let me just so with this parameter that I talked about, parameters, that's the basis. We have developed a methodology in data collection that was supported, highly supported, in the multi-stakeholder consultation that OHCHR organized last September here in Geneva, attended by statisticians, representatives of NHRIs, UN agencies, and civil society organizations. So this slide is supposed to be a summary of that methodology, but there's something wrong. But so essentially, what we have done is we have developed a definition of armed conflict based on international humanitarian law and ICRC's research and legal opinions throughout the years. So a definition of non-international armed conflict and international armed conflict. Second, we have developed an approach to identify armed conflicts in practice based on assessments issued by the United Nations. So, for example, by the UN Security Council, the Human Rights Council, and its special procedures, the Secretary General, and OHCHR. Also, assessments by ICRC and International Criminal Court and other relevant courts. So we have also developed a definition of conflict-related debts, which includes both direct debts and indirect debts. So we define direct debts are debts where there are reasonable grounds to believe that they resulted directly from war operations and that the acts, decisions, or other purposes that caused these debts were closely related to conflict. So these debts may have been caused by the use of weapons or other means and methods. And we defined indirect debts as debts resulting only indirectly from war operations and are typically linked to a loss of access to essential goods and services. So we also, for acts to be related to armed conflict, the existence of an armed conflict is a necessary precondition. So to distinguish acts that might take place during the conflict but are not related to the conflict, we have this nexus requirement which must be fulfilled. So a determination of death is conflict related is highly factually dependent. So the determination is made on the basis of a minimum data requirement while taking into account the specific circumstances in each case. And I will talk a bit more about this minimum data requirement. So essentially, the methodology development and data collection follows a concentric approach. So as you will see in this diagram, you have three concentric circles. So we begin the development of the methodology and data collection with the documented direct debts, then estimation of undocumented direct debts, and finally estimation of indirect debts. So we begin with the methodology for documented direct debts. So like I said, what is a documented and verified case? So this is the set of relevant information on a particular debt that provides the data source or data provider with reasonable grounds to believe that the death occurred and was conflict related. So the methodology for this part of the concentric circle asks for a minimum data requirement, which includes the status, name, sex, age of victim, status of alleged perpetrators, location, and date of death. So this is actually included in the earlier slide, which is not showing. So maybe Emily, I don't know if you have the other version of the PowerPoint, so we could show that. But so essentially, we have included name because they serve as a means to deconflict information to avoid duplicate counting. So, however, to the extent possible, conflict-related deaths of unidentified individuals should also be recorded and verified as well, and maybe included in the analysis and reporting. So data will be coming from a range of sources, including government agencies, national statistical offices, national human rights institutions, NGOs, media, and other civil society sources. And OHCHR will serve as an independent body that will be assessing data sources, and independent and reliable sources will be used. For the methodology on documented direct debts, we have also attempted to have more analytical capabilities, especially to support the work on humanitarian and human rights work. So we wanted to specify further the definition of direct debts, and we have developed draft categories of lawful and unlawful debts with more detailed categories that are based on the International Classification of Crime Statistics, a classification that is approved by the UN Statistical Commission. So this is work in progress. So as I mentioned earlier, during the multi-stakeholder consultation we had in Geneva, there was general acceptance of the approach and the methodology, and participants also recommended that we continue the work on lawful and unlawful categories based on the ICCS, the International Classification of Statistics. So the next steps for the development of this methodology is that we have to pilot test the methodology in selected situations of conflict. We are expecting to compile data on the first concentric circle, so the documented direct debts for 2015, that's the baseline year for the SDGs, and 2016. we will continue coordinating with data partners and possibly organize a meeting with stakeholders. And we'll submit results of the pilot studies to the IAG SDGs and request to fast track the indicator to tier 2 sometime in 2018. So I guess that's my 7 minutes. I hope it didn't take so long. But so thank you very much. This is just the information on our homepage and our email address should you have any questions regarding the methodology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. I think that due to the machinery of the discussion to the end, and we continue with the presenters so that we save time. So I shift to Kristine's presentation. And Kristine, you have the floor now.
Great, thank you. Is my mic okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so right, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program provides events level data on organized violence. If we relate it to Grace's slides, it's basically this inner circle of documented deaths that we focus on. And we categorize organized violence according to different categories depending on the actors involved. So was it belligerents fighting each other, or is it actors targeting civilians? And I'm happy to elaborate on our definitions and our criteria in the Q&A, but I thought that I would not focus on describing UCDP. I'm hoping that you have seen it before instead. We have written a short memo together with Håvard Nygård at PRIO, and it's published as a PRIO paper that discusses the UCDP definitions and methodology and how they relate to the content of Grace's presentation, basically. So this information that we have about sort of how thinking currently is about how to measure the SDG 16. Right, let's see if I can manage my slide here. So our data are based on events. Any given event can result in one or more fatalities. And this is the front side of our web page, where you can see from the circles the amount of events or fatalities that occurred in each place. Just to give you an idea of sort of the scope of what we collect and sort of how much data we have, in 2016, we have about 11,500 fatality or conflict events recorded. And we coded those using about 55,000 news articles and then another 10,000 articles specific to Syria, and then a series of additional sources. So that's about to give you an idea of the we're working with. And as we code, this is basically what it looks like. Each event is a row that gives us information about the actors involved and where the event took place and who died. Was it belligerents and civilians? But because of the short time frame for this presentation, I thought I would save the discussion of what we do and instead focus more on what we've gotten in terms of pushback to our data, because I think that's probably more relevant to the discussion here. And in that sense, we've had sort of two sets of pushback, I would say. The first set focuses on conceptual issues. So UCDP's vision of what armed conflict is differs to some extent from what other people's vision or organizations' vision of armed conflict is. In particular, we specify that to include violence in our data set, we need to be able to identify the actors involved in any given event. There are people who would like to see a broader interpretation of conflict, so that events that maybe can't be attributed to one of the conflict parties, but which take place nonetheless in conflict environments would be included. So this can be criminal homicides, riotings, or just fatalities that result from unknown perpetrators, sort of bodies on the side of the road, that sort of thing. There are also people who believe to record conflict or to count conflict deaths properly, you also need to include indirect deaths, which Grace has talked about. Right, so these are deaths that are excess mortality, right, that are a consequence of living in a war zone. So there are no, hospitals are being shelled, you can't get the hospital, you can't get the doctors, water supplies damaged, that sort of thing. UCDP only records direct deaths, so deaths that have an element of intentionality, usually through the use of arms. In terms of the critique we receive, a lot of times people are saying, you know, that our estimates, our fatality estimates, are much lower than other fatality estimates, and to a certain degree, some of that is due to the narrower scope of what we include in armed conflict. Our more restrictive definition of conflict violence means that because we need to be able to attribute the violence to certain parties, we almost always will have lower estimates than what others do who are more who are less restrictive in the way in which they include violence in conflict. The second set of critiques that we tend to get are more methodological, and they have to do with measurement. And here the critique tends to focus on UCDP's use of media sources and the biases that are inherent to media sources, which we are certainly cognizant of, seeing as we deal with them every day. Media reporting and the problems with media reporting is a huge topic, and we could spend hours talking about it. So I'm only going to highlight a couple points related to this. The first is that it's true that UCDP uses media reports as a baseline for coding our event data for the globe. So we do searches for every country every year. And by media sources, it's also important to point out that we're using both international news wires, but we're also using extensively local sources, sort of radio Lomé kind of sources that we get in translation. But in addition to media sources, we supplement that with other sources to the extent that they exist and that they're publicly available, and we're able to apply our coding criteria to them. And a lot of times this means local NGOs, it can be international organizations who issue reports, it can be special investigations, truth and reconciliation commissions, and so on and so forth. So to the extent that that data is available, we go through it, we code it, validate it as much as we can, and include it in our estimates. All of my takeaways came up at the same time. So that means if you look at the data that's publicly available on our webpage right now, about 70% of the events are coded using media sources. The other 30% are coded using these additional sources. So it's a fairly large number that come from additional sources in addition to media. And in terms of the problems with media sources and the problems with obtaining good conflict data in these environments, you know, we have always encouraged people to understand our estimates not as a sort of true count, but as a baseline estimate that we can be sure of, that we validated and we're sure that this many at least took place. In that sense, it's also, particularly as you move forward thinking about trying to estimate indirect deaths, I think it's important also to point out that there are places where researchers have been able to do more in-depth studies, and able to record all conflict fatalities and demographic information, identifying information, these sort of Book of the Dead types of projects. These situations are fairly rare compared to the number of conflicts that are out there, and they tend to occur in post-conflict settings where the state is willing to allow access to investigators and access to its records. And we incorporate those projects to the extent that the data are available and they exist. But what I want to sort of underscore by raising that point is just to keep in mind that the way in which violence occurs, the dynamics of violence on the ground, varies very much from context to context, and the way in which that violence is then reported on, both in media and in other channels, also varies very much from context to context. So it's important not to extrapolate from experiences in one particular country to the rest of the population, particularly as you perhaps move into thinking about excess mortality. The way excess mortality is generated in Iraq is going to be very different from the way it's generated in Nepal or in other contexts, which is one of the challenges of what we work with. Finally, just in closing, our mission at UCDP is to make some sort of annual global fatality estimate of armed conflict. And so given that aim, we're using what we consider the best possible methodology, really only the viable methodology that we can use given that aim. And we've spent the last 40 years improving on our sources, improving on our data collection procedures in order to ensure that we're capturing as much as we possibly can that's out there on conflict fatalities, given the parameters of what we want to do. I think people who are working with different kinds of aims will be able to use different methodologies. But this is where we've landed in terms of finding an approach that's practicable for making annual global. That's it for me.
Okay. No, thank you, Kristine. I think that you also had some issues with a blank page of your PowerPoint. Yeah, exactly. So we have to learn that this is a challenge with this tool, with this webinar software. Okay. So Hana is next to me, and so I give her the floor, and then we move on to the next presentation.
Okay, hello everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. And so as Anna said, I wrote a briefing paper that was commissioned by the Small Arms Survey on measuring violent deaths in Libya. And the framing was really, what are the opportunities and challenges for indicator 16.1.2? And so that's how the research was done. And the methodology was based on interviews with international organizations, local NGOs, government sources on how casualties have been recorded in Libya since the revolution in 2011. Okay, I don't know if you can see the slides or if they're just blank, but basically this is just a quick overview of the SDG indicator, and Grace already explained that it's being built up now, the methodology with OHCHR, and so this paper intends to support the discussion of the development of a methodology by having a concrete case studies where we highlighted methodological, practical, and political challenges to recording. Oh, sorry. Okay, great. So why Libya as a case study? Basically, it's a current and protracted armed conflict, and not to say that Libya is a typical conflict, but the nature of the conflict is typical of conflicts in the MENA region. Basically, since the end of the Gaddafi regime, Libya has experienced high level of political unrest and armed violence, marked by competing governments, competing authorities, armed actors, and failed states, and also kind of actors, like radical actors like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So the key findings were basically that the casualty estimates in Libya have varied significantly over the years, and this is mainly due to the approach used, so casualty recording versus estimation. But even within one approach, the estimates have varied, or the counts have varied, because of different capacities for the organizations, different definitions, inconsistent inclusion and exclusion criteria. Basically, one of the main challenges that was highlighted while interviewing these organizations is the issue, this definitional issue of what constitutes armed violence and what constitutes armed conflict. And in Libya, when there's like a breakdown of security, there is both, and they coexist, and it's very difficult for casualty recorders sometimes to distinguish that. And I think that presents a real challenge to how 16.1 is formulated, assuming that you can count in a conflict homicides and conflict-related deaths separately. And again, so another finding is that it's in Libya, it's relatively a low-intensity conflict if you look at the casualty numbers, but because of the insecurity, there's a small pool of credible sources that are available, and that could lead to selection bias. So, estimation could be a way of validating. So just to be clear on what we're talking about, casualty recording is is what UCDP does. It's document-based, it could be investigation-based, and I've also included crowdsourcing because it was used by OHCHR at the beginning of the Libya conflict. They use crowdsourcing for the Libya crisis map. Estimations is all types of surveys, excess mortalities, and multiple system estimations. Now, a note on multiple system estimations, because I know Grace brought it up, and in the concentric approach as a second or third tier, multiple system estimation, if I'm sure everyone is familiar with, requires 2 or more sources of data to work, and so in a sense it is highly dependent on casualty recording data or any sort of documentation. So you know, you can't have one without the other.
Back to the first column.
Yeah. So these are the entities that I looked at and I analyzed. It's the Libyan Ministry for the Affairs of Family and Martyrs, which was initially in the National Transitional Government, then the General National Council, which came after by election, then OCHA, and I mean, this is not in time, but OCHA and the United Nations Support Mission to Libya. The only NGO which I can find, which was a LibyaBodyCount.org, which was media-based, and one population survey was identified, and it was done by the University of Tripoli. And I won't talk about it because it's also a long story. I'll just focus on the casualty recording sources. So there's a, I don't know if you can see the graph, but there's a graph, and basically what this graph tells us is that the efforts for recording casualties in Libya have not been continuous and have taken places over different periods of time, okay? And so this is mainly, you know, there's lots of reasons for this, but usually it's because of capacity and organizational mandates. And when it is possible to compare figures in the same time period, you can see that they are quite varied. And this is due to so in 2011 and 2012, the one that is compared is the survey, which had a much higher mortality rate, to the government number, which was issued by the Libyan Ministry of Martyrs. And then later on in this year, this past year, this was a comparison between the Libya body count, which used media-based, and the United Nations mission, support mission in Libya. So, on methodological challenges, oh sorry, I keep doing this. Like we said, the main finding was that definitions, inclusions, and exclusion criteria were inconsistent. So armed violence versus armed conflict, we discussed this, I think, at length, and OHCHR has come up with definitions, but I guess my point is saying it's kind of harder to apply them on the ground when we're looking at, you know, different periods of time in Libya. So, for example, in 2011, the conflict ended, and then, you know, according to experts, it began again in 2014 as a result of a clash between the outgoing General National Council and the National and the House of Representatives. So, in between these two phases of armed conflicts, the boundaries between politically motivated violence, conflict, and criminal violence were extremely hard to distinguish, and this is an example by Human Rights Watch. They documented a wave of politically motivated assassination in 2013, and it seemed that armed groups were taking advantage of the government not willing to enforce law or not willing to investigate, to also, you know, kill people for political reasons and also for financial reasons, and so it was very difficult to qualify these deaths. So the second issue here is definitions. You know, what is a civilian? What is a combatant? And in addition, in the Middle East, there's this term that is usually used, which is martyr. And martyr refers to those who died at the hand, like in Libya, the term martyr referred to those who died at the hand of the of the regime. So who is a martyr and who isn't is a political term. It's often an emotional term, and it's hard to, when you're thinking about recording casualties, it's not really defined, and so it's difficult to integrate it with other casualty counts. And my final point about civilians and combatants is that of the entities which I reviewed, some of them only recorded civilians, and some, like the Libyan Ministry of Martyrs and Martyrs and missing people, only recorded combatants, because their mandate was to give compensation to the family of combatants, and they didn't want to say too much about the civilians who died in the conflict, obviously for political reasons. So quickly, these conflict dynamics, which we see in many conflicts, basically in the MENA region and maybe around the world. So the problem with competing authorities in Libya is that they often use the same name. For example, there's 2 ministries of defense, and when they issue counts, you're wondering, well, who issued this count and who are they counting exactly? Hybrid security institutions just refers to this concept that has been very well studied by the Small Arms Survey, where civilians will join armed groups to protect themselves, but they will be civilians during the day, and it's very difficult to identify who they are allied with and who the perpetrator is, or which side who killed who, basically. Undeclared belligerents, that's kind of a more unique aspect of the Libyan conflict. So basically, since the middle of 2014, there's been airstrikes by the US, but also by other parties who haven't declared themselves. And one of the recorders who was interviewed said that was really a challenge, because you can't identify where the weapons are coming from or who they were targeting. The media landscape, which Kristine has touched on, basically the situation in Libya is that it went from a exclusively state-controlled media to a flourish of privately owned media. However, that didn't really signify free and fair press. Mostly armed groups, businessmen, power brokers in the countries were paying to put out information and to own their own media outlet. And so lots of the recorders who do casualty recording in Libya felt that the media would be a very last source for them if they were to even consider them as a source. And the capacity and security situation is such that, for example, the UN is based in Tunis, the United Nations Support Mission in Libya, the ICRC as well, and so remote, there's some challenges with access, investigation, etc. So final point, sorry for dragging on. Basically, even though I outlined this whole kind of litany of difficulties in Libya, I think that measuring conflict-related deaths is possible in Libya, but so far there hasn't been one entity which was responsible for it, and that's where we see the variations. I think just as Grace identified, the situation in Libya calls for multiple source approach, multiple actors underpinned by a common methodology, and that basically this methodology, this process has to be well resourced, and it has to have the right capacity and have the right mandate for doing this work. And very final words, I'm associated with Every Casualty worldwide, and last year we published the standards on casualty recording, and I think that should be a key standardization document for the OHCHR and for Libya and for other situations as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hana. With the assistance of Emilia, we go back to the cover, and now we face the challenge of making this system work for the discussion. So I think that if you have, you should know there is a hand raised. There are currently no question requests, so ask a question button. Use the button that is ask a question. Who is there? Eva. Eva, please go ahead. Eva?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, now yes. Yeah. Hello.
I was like slightly worried. Hi, I'm Eva Sarlin. I'm military, head of military advocacy at Air Wars, and I mostly monitor or solely monitor Syria and Iraq. But as an organization, we've just launched a project in Libya, so hopefully we're able to help with that region or that conflict, and kind of provide a long-term consistent overview of what's happened. And mostly we monitor foreign belligerents. So mostly the US-led coalition in Syria and Iraq, and also Russia. I think what I just wanted to bring a point of what we face as a challenge, because Airwars as an organization has been quoted to have quite low numbers, because what we publish is always, we already really use the minimum number. So say there's a report, there's a strike by the coalition in Raqqa in Syria, and there is, the death range was from 5 to 25. We would always say 5. That would be the minimum. We wouldn't use a median a number. So I was just wondering if you had like any insights on how you can how you can avoid underreporting, or how you can kind of represent in the data the kind of range of numbers that that's coming from the field, from the civilians themselves.
Actually, I think that we will
need to take voice.
wait just a second. Take your voice back. It's difficult to operate. So while we wait for other questions, I'd like to say that we would like then to give the floor to all the speakers to answer the questions together. So I think that an important aspect is the highly political setting in which this indicator will work. That makes it slightly different from the other hundreds of indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. So obviously the statistical perfection that is necessary for correct measurement needs to be balanced by all these aspects that we are looking in different data collections. So is there anyone who wants to make a comment or ask a question before I give the floor back? Okay, is Hamid?
I think Grace wants to ask.
Okay, there is Grace or Kristine. So if the speakers, if they don't mind, I would like to give the floor first to the questions, and then give back to the speakers to respond. Is that okay? Hamid, you have the floor. Hamid? Hello? You cannot hear? Okay, now you are on.
All right. Yeah, the question I want to ask was related to the work that the UN is planning to do next year on piloting. What is being proposed there? Could you give us a few more details about that? Because it sounds very interesting and something that we in every casualty would be very much interested in contributing towards.
Excellent. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before going back to the speakers to answer. If there anyone, if not, then I will go in order. And Grace, can she?
She can speak freely.
Okay, Grace.
Thank you, Anna.
Your microphone is a little low again, Grace.
Okay. Okay, maybe I have to. And is this better now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So maybe I reply to the first question on how you can avoid underreporting, the question of Eva, and so so what we have in the methodology right now is we have a minimum data requirement, which is quite strict, because we're asking for the name of the victim. And for us, that's a means to deconflict the information, so we avoid deduplicating. But of course, like you mentioned, that could skew the data. That is why, to the extent possible, we also have this flexibility in the methodology to count unidentified individuals, and we are going to figure out a way how we could incorporate that in our SDG analysis and reporting. And the other approach that we have is that we have this is exactly why we have these concentric circles. So we know that if we focus on documented direct deaths only, there is a high risk that we would underreport the deaths, conflict-related deaths. So this is why we added a second approach, which is to find out what kind of methodology we could develop to estimate undocumented direct deaths. And for the question of Hamid on piloting more details, I think my colleague, maybe Nicola, could add more information. But what we are doing right now is that we are finalizing the criteria that we would use to select pilot countries, and we are writing a strategy starting the end of this year until we report to the IAG how we would implement the pilot. So Nicola, I don't know, Nicola, my colleagues Nicola and Sonia, maybe they would like to add.
If you want to add things, because they're not presenters, they also need to ask a question. So if they want to add, you can indicate by raising your hand.
Nicola? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Nicola, I don't know if you're speaking, but we can't hear you. There we go.
Okay, now.
I'm on. It's okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much to the presenters, and I think this is this was a useful presentations, and so I know the work of Grace, of course, but thanks Kristine and Hana for your presentation. I think the in moving forward, and as our findings are really quite similar to the finding that Hana presented based on the experience in the situation in Libya. So that this need to develop a common, more common approach on some of this data collection and bring those data together, because they are data available in different contexts, but by different organizations. How to bring those data together? It's part of the work, and definitely, and also part of the challenge. So this is where this minimum data requirement is really essential, and we very keen to work with other organizations to do that. We cannot do it by ourselves. So I think we would be happy to discuss this further with interested organizations. I think the purpose of this meeting was about bringing those other stakeholders, organizations active in the field. I think that maybe there are many more than the one that we have managed to be able to participate, I think, in this discussion. So, but we need together to strengthen the momentum and work together to bring those different data in the compilation of this indicator. So I think this is we have identified the list of countries based on the definition and the approach which was submitted. We need to go and collect the data for those different countries and to context. So having a list of organizations which are the primary data sources which work on the ground for those organizations would be extremely useful in moving forward. I think they said the work of Uppsala and colleagues that work more on which are more secondary data source from the perspective of data collection is also very useful for cross-checking the data that we have. So we ideally we would in moving forward in populating these indicators, we see the need to have more systematic regular meetings of this kind and with broader constituencies to learn from the different experience and validate also the data compilations we will have. So we are planning to have meetings where we will present also a result for some countries. So I think Grace will also in trying to populate the data for different countries will we will get back to you and the other interested organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Just to clarify that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted online, so we can then agree about how to share it further. And as you say, this is to start getting the ball rolling and to continue consultations with stakeholders. We have 3 minutes before the line drops, and so please, Kristine, for your comments.
I can respond to the first question about conservative estimates and how to manage that. Our approach is to generate a low, a best, and a high estimate. Our best estimate is typically a fairly conservative one as well, but this allows us to manage problems when we have conflicting fatality estimates from different sources, or when we have doubts about possible biases from sources, or if we have doubts about possible duplication, we can use the high estimate to that effect. Even so, our high estimates tend to be low in comparison to the work other people are doing. And then just a word on duplication. We haven't really had that many problems with it because most of the time you have fairly specific temporal and geographic information that allows us to distinguish between events as well as contextual information. So I would say it's extremely rare that we have information like names or even the sex or age of fatalities, but we're able to distinguish events from one another using this contextual.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. And Hana.
Yeah, I think, on the question of ranges, our colleagues Hamid and John here have, a lot of experience with IBC, but just to note, Eva, Air Wars was part of the interviews on Libya, so just to know. Yeah, I don't think I have any other comments.
Okay, so that makes us the most on time team. We regret that we missed the contribution from Howard Nigel, who fell sick this morning and so was unable to join us. We are really very happy that we can contribute to this discussion. It's a very important discussion. It's close to our core topics, and we will do our best to make sure that there is a forum where this discussion can be continued. And so we will welcome ideas about further initiatives and things like that. Thank you also for your comments in chat. I see that you are getting to know each other. That was exactly the purpose of this webinar. And I would like to wish everybody a nice afternoon and goodbye. Thank you.
We ended in general?
Mm-hmm.